José Olivarez is son of Mexican immigrants, and that's, I think, something he wears proudly on his sleeve. I think it heavily informs who he is as a person and certainly his art as a poet. The book that we're going to be talking about is Citizen Illegal, and it is filled with incredible chronicles of him growing up in the city of Chicago as a Mexican American. And he shares a lot of experiences that I think a lot of us are familiar with, and that is growing up in a secluded part of the city that you really feel is like its own world. Like I grew up in Ukrainian Village here in the city of Chicago before it was Ukrainian Village here in the city of Chicago. And it felt like its own world. Like when I finally moved out of the neighborhood, I was like, yo, this other Chicago exists. And I think Jose beautifully paints that picture with words.
So we've got him on the line. Let's bring him in. Jose,
hey.
Welcome. Welcome to La Vida Baseball Live.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You know, it's crazy. I coordinated this conversation, and I didn't say that he had to wear anything in particular to impress us. But look, he shows up with a White Sox cap. I'm digging it. Jose, what's up, hermano?
What's going on, Jesse? How you doing? It's good to see you.
I'm doing good. So let's go ahead and do you your due diligence. José Olivarez is the son of Mexican immigrants. His debut book of poems, Citizen Illegal, was a finalist for the Penn Gene Stein Award and a winner of the 2018 Chicago Review of Books Poetry Prize. It was named a top book of 2018 by NPR and the New York Public Library, along with Felicia Chavez and Willie Perdomo. He is also co-editing the forthcoming anthology, The Breakbeat Poets Volume 4, Latinx. José Olivarez joins us from right here in Chicago, Illinois. How are you, my man?
I'm good. It's good to be on La Vida Baseball.
Thank you for being here with us. So, like Jesse mentioned earlier, you're originally from Calumet City, a southern burb in Chicago. In your book, Citizen Illegal, you talk about the city and how it felt like a different world. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so I was born on the east side of Chicago in South Chicago. And so my earliest memories are of like going to the corner store for my parents and just being immersed in that neighborhood, in that community. And so for the first, good chunk of my life, I had no idea that I was living in Chicago or that Chicago was not a part of Mexico. You know what I mean? Like I would visit my grandparents in Mexico and we would speak Spanish all the time. And then we would come back to South Chicago and we would be living our lives in Spanish. So it wasn't until I moved to Calumet City that I realized that, the small world that I had been a part of was only part of a bigger world, right? So Calumet City was like where I started to speak English and those sorts of things.
So I have the honor of owning a copy of Citizen Illegal. And it's my opinion, Jose, that this book of poems would be comforting to anyone navigating dual identities. I know in reading these pages, I also found pieces of myself throughout the book. For you, though, you explore the spaces between Mexico and, of course, the United States. When were you yourself made aware of that distinction?
I think it was when I started to go to public school in Calumet City. The first time that I showed up to try and attend pre-kindergarten, they wouldn't let me sign up for class, and it was because they didn't have any English language learner instructors, right? So my very first experience trying to go to school in the United States was of being rejected, and it made me feel like there was something wrong with speaking Spanish. There was something wrong with being Mexican. It made me feel like my identity was a burden. My identity was a problem for other people. But I would say that the other thing is that then as I grew older and I kept visiting Mexico, I also experienced this understanding of like, all right, well, I don't entirely fit in Calumet City, but when I go back and I'm supposed to be going back to Mexico, I don't, people call me a gringo there. And so it took a while of like bouncing back and forth and feeling like, all right, if I don't belong here and I don't belong there, then where can I call home? Like what place is there for me?
That's very, very interesting. Where and when did your love of words begin?
Yeah. The first song I ever memorized was the song Changes by Tupac. I first heard that song when my cousins from California like brought us cassette tapes, like little mixtapes of stuff that they recorded back in Los Angeles. Um, and at the time, I didn't know that I was going to become a poet. I just knew that like listening to Tupac, listening to Cypress Hill, and listening to hip hop was the first time that uh, it felt like I could start to piece together a culture that was kind of uniquely mine. Like up until that time, of course, I listened to my parents' music. My parents loved Los Bukis and Juan Gabriel and Vicente Fernandez and all these other really incredible artists. But then I started to sort of craft an identity separate from them. And that sort of came with hip hop, with listening to Tupac, with kind of listening to what the message was saying, and then taking a look at my environment and being like, oh, segregation is over, and yet our school is hyper segregated, and our classrooms are tracked in these specific ways that are racially coded. How come we don't talk about that in our classrooms? And so, for me, that love of language is also tied to like learning to pay attention to social justice issues in my own neighborhood, in my own school.
It's so interesting how language and identity are so intertwined. Even during the course of this conversation with you, Jose, I'm finding it that I'm changing between registers. Do I call him Jose or do I call him Jose? And it's like that in my day-to-day life. When I'm ordering food, do I say, oh, yeah, I'll take 2 tacos? Or do I say, dame 2 tacos? Yeah. And so for you, did you find that language was also a tool for you to explore your identity, to own the fact that you had this dual identity?
Yeah, for me, it was in language, and specifically in the language of poets that I've come to adore, poets like Willie Perdomo and Sandra Cisneros. And I can't remember the name of the author, but he wrote a book called Down These Mean Streets that takes place in New York City. That's really incredible. That made me feel like, one, I wasn't alone. Two, I wasn't crazy for feeling this in-betweenness. And then three, that the in-betweenness didn't have to be so lonely, right? That it could be a place that was shared by this like incredible collective of people called Latinos, or now we say Latinx, right? And so Latinx became a space, and like finding that language, finding a name for myself, whether it's Latinx or Chicano, became a way to find a home for myself through language.
And this is a conversation that we were having this morning, talking about our identity, how we identify here in the United States. Are we Latino? Are we Latin American? Are we Dominican American? Cuban
Hispanic.
American, Hispanic. There's so many complexities involved in all of that. But one of the things that I would agree with, and I'm sure that you would too, is that our culture and our upbringing is what really influences how we identify. And is that something that you agree with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the older I get, the less important nationalism is to me. So when I was younger, I think it was very important to identify myself as a Mexicano. But Mexico is a country that is also imperfect. So it's not about creating a binary where Mexico is perfect and the United States is messed up or has messed up policies. Like, both places are imperfect, but it's about, for me, like, part of like whatever pride I take place in the name Chicano, in the name Mexicano, Latinx, comes from like the deep love that I have for my family, for my people, and not for like the laws of the land, but for the people that make it what it is, right? Like, I take a lot of pride and I have a lot of love for mi gente. I don't know if I'm explaining it well, but that's how I feel.
You're a poet. Anything you say sounds like, I don't know, poetry. You are watching La Vida Baseball. He is José Olivarez, a Chicago-based poet and author of the book of poems Citizen Ilegal. I am Jesus Menendez, or Jesse Menendez, depending on who I'm speaking with. If it's my dad, I'm Jesus. That's Jennifer Mercedes. Yeah, absolutely. He's the only one that calls me Jesus. Quick aside, it wasn't until I was about 5 or 6 that I realized my name isn't Jesse. It's Jesus.
So your
my government name. My government name is Jesus Eduardo Menendez.
And where did Jesse come from?
I have no idea. I didn't make it up. I blame my family. I blame my
So they
family.
just started calling you Jesse?
Yeah. They just, and it's not the same thing.
No.
It's not the same thing. So, Jose, we're talking about your development in terms of poetry and how your experiences growing up in Calumet City informed who you are, and how at a certain point poetry also became your vehicle to express your experiences. I see that you're wearing a Sox cap. It's something that I referenced earlier in this conversation. In your book, Citizen Illegal, you also talk about sports, specifically basketball. But since you are wearing a baseball hat, I want to ask about sports in general. In your opinion, because sports is so global, and I think it is one of the institutions where you are kind of able to see folks who look like you in a professional setting, how did that develop your worldview? Sports, I mean.
In a couple of big ways, right? One, I think about masculinity, and of course, being Latinx, machismo is a big thing that I've been trying to unlearn. But like one of the first ways that I first developed a relationship with my dad, for example, was through sports. Every time there was a big boxing match, my dad would throw a party, and whenever Julio Cesar Chavez won, like he would get super happy and he would hug everybody. And so sports and sports celebrations were like one of the first ways that I learned that it was okay for men to show joy, that it was okay for men to like touch one another, to hug. Outside of sports, the men that I grew up with like had like a very kind of cool exterior, right? They didn't show a ton of emotion. So sports, right away I took to it because I was like, in sports, you can celebrate, you can dance, you can laugh, you can have fun, So that's one thing. And then, of course, like growing up in Chicago and then in Calumet City, the Chicago Bulls were dominant, right? And so everywhere I looked, everything had Michael Jordan on it. Everybody was wearing Jordans. And so like developing part of like that, sports helped me find a story that felt good to be a part of, right? It made it mean something, that I was not just Mexican, that I was not just Chicano, but I was growing up in this incredible place called Chicago.
It's interesting that I had never even heard it be expressed in that way, as far as how sports can help somebody grow out of that machismo attitude. And you explained it perfectly, in the sense that in sports you see, particularly men's sports, you see men congratulate each other. You see them hug each other, touch each other,
they
celebrate
cry.
each other, and show emotion in that. And for it to have impacted you in such a way it's very interesting. I assume that it has helped probably many, many men in that sense, because when you grow up in an environment that you have to be tough and have a tough exterior, you don't see that. But for it to be such an impactful thing in that way, I'm surprised, because I hadn't heard it that way. But it's very interesting, and that's a conversation to be had that could be had
Sure. It's its own topic of discussion, most certainly. Jose, there's a number of things that I love about this book, and one of them is the inclusion of your family, specifically the stories of not just growing up here in Chicago, but you also talk about how they came to the United States and what that journey was like. You also talk about how, when we're talking about machismo, how your father disciplined you, and it's almost as if you reimagine those situations and remember them through the lens of you now as an adult, as opposed to completely remembering them how they took place. Talk about the inclusion of your family in those instances specifically that I just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Real quick, I don't want to just glorify sports, because certainly like the culture of sports fandom can also be toxic, and can also just like further reinforce machismo. So I don't want to pretend that it's all like a feminist pursuit, right? But for me, that was one of the first places where I got to see men show emotion, and that was important. In terms of like including my family in the book, one of the things that was important for me was, oftentimes in the broad American imagination, when we talk about Latinx people, we tend to only look at the wound. And so specifically, like if we're talking about Mexican people, if we're talking about descendants of Central America or the Caribbean, we tend to talk only about the act of immigration, and no one, there's less kind of emphasis on like what happens post immigration, right? But that act is a big act, and of course, it has ripples. It continues to have effects long after people immigrate or come to this country. So for me, part of what I wanted to do was I wanted to write a collection of poems that um, was not just looking at the womb, but was also looking at what happens after the womb, right? Like what happens after migration? How does it continue to ripple and unfold? And in terms of like writing about my family, I wanted to write about them with the same tenderness that I would write about myself, right? And so I didn't want people to read the book and come away like feeling pity for the speaker. I didn't want them to feel like I had had an abusive upbringing, because that's not true. I wanted them to see the way that like life is hard and complicated, and if you've migrated from an entirely different culture and had an entirely different upbringing, you know, it's hard to figure out what's like, standards are always shifting, right? And so how do you figure out how to raise young men, how to raise young people in a brand new country when you like don't share the same exact language? And even when me and my parents were sharing the same language, there were disconnects, you know what I mean? Because language is so fragile like that. It can move so quickly.
You know, I want to stick on that thread for a second, because I think, like you, I share the experience where my family disciplined in a way that I think had a little more of a physical edge to it. Again, also not to suggest that this is a commonality shared by Latinos in general. Specifically, I'm referring to what you shared and my own experiences here. We had something hanging on the back of the door in the living room that we referred to as the cuarta. And this was the disciplinary tool that was used whenever one of us would step out of line. Why do you think, considering where we are at now and how we're able to view those situations through a different lens, why do you think that was the method that our families chose to discipline us, to show affection, if you will? Because I don't know about you, but I remember on many occasions what was said to me after a whooping was, I do this because I love you. I want you to understand right from wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I got the same message. In my house, it was like a leather belt. It had like a big cow belt buckle. And, you know, I have terrible memories of that belt. Like, I'll never look at a white belt and smile. Every time I see a white belt, I'm like, not that one. So, you know, to answer your question, like, one, it's not just our people, right? Of course, we hear stories all the time about how people discipline their kids. I think that being a parent is really hard, you know what I mean? And you want to show, like, you want to teach your children and not lead them down the wrong path. And how do you do that? And I think if you've been raised a particular way, then it's hard. Like, if you have no reason to imagine a different way of raising children, then, you know, maybe you don't. Of course, that, you know, people change all the time. Like, I don't have children, but if I have children, I already know that I'll be disciplining my children differently, just because, you know, I wouldn't want my children to experience that type of physical trauma, even if it's a temporary trauma, even if it ultimately protected me sometimes. I think people make choices, and it's very easy to like judge people for it, but people are trying the best that they can. You know what I'm saying? And so when I think about like my dad's choices, I think he was trying to teach me. It's just very hard to accept that when, you know, you're also talking about physical punishment. Like, it's just hard to separate the lesson from the means.
But I would also say, in continuation to what you're saying, in agreeing with people have choices, you're the perfect example, and as you are, Jesse, too, that when you go through something like that, something that can be traumatic, you don't necessarily have to be a victim of the traumas that you suffered in your childhood. You can choose to grow out of that or break that cycle, because I think that's what we've been afforded here as being second or third generation Latinos in the US, is that we see things through a different perspective now. We don't necessarily see them through the perspective of our parents because they were brought up a different way. Culturally, it's different back home. Once they're here and you go through life seeing things differently, we are afforded that opportunity to choose to break the cycle, which is what I think you did, Jose, and you explore what it is like to break that cycle, but what that cycle could be like.
Absolutely. And again, this goes back to the power of language for me, right? Which is that language allows us to see other possibilities. And so I know that for me, that is very true. I always dreamt of breaking the cycle, but I used to think about breaking the cycle as like not being the bad thing. It's easy to imagine, not disciplining children physically. It's harder to imagine, well, then how are you going to teach them, right? What are those lessons going to look like? How are you going to instill in them the love and confidence so that you don't have to make those type of decisions? You know what I mean? So for me, imagining becomes a way of breaking the cycle, trying to reach for other possibilities.
100% agree. Now, you are a hardworking man. This has afforded you the opportunity to attend Ivy League school, Harvard University. Coming from where you come from and where you ended up, what has that been like for you, and what was that initial moment like for you as well?
It's a trip. It was a trip when I was in college. I remember, Harvard has this big open grassy area called the Yard, and I would walk through the Yard, and sometimes I would hear people Spanish, and I would hear people speaking Spanish, and I would get so excited. I'd be like, "Mi gente, what's going on?" And then, I'd see who was talking, and it was just, like a regular white person. It was disorienting. Everybody spoke Spanish at Harvard, so it was a trip. I think it was also a trip because so I was the first person from my high school to go to Harvard College. I was there by myself. I didn't know other people, and so it just took me a long time to kind of get accustomed to what the culture was there, to meet people, to develop relationships. So it was an experience. I used to look at my ID card and I'd be like, maybe I'm at like Harvard College, community college. Like maybe there's two Harvard and I'm at the community college, because it didn't make sense to me. Imposter syndrome is hard to deal with.
Now, because you just said you were the first one from your high school to attend Harvard University, prior to going, were you ever met with backlash or maybe saying, who do you think you are to think that you could even be accepted into such a prestigious university?
No, not really. I was, as a high school student, especially as I got into poetry, I became a really big trash talker. So I remember my senior year, I would just, I was just talking trash, like just making, I had no reason to believe any of this, but I was like, yeah, I could get into the University of Chicago. I could get into Harvard University. I could get in anywhere. Like, are you kidding me? And my friends, they were like, all right, Mr. Big Talk, you want to talk? Then let's see you apply. Let's see you go for it. And I was terrified, and I did it anyway because I couldn't back down, and I ended up getting in. So my mouth got me into trouble, but it also got me into Harvard, I guess.
And what was terrifying, not necessarily the experience, but when he saw what tuition was going to be like, he was like, oh, damn, I didn't expect this. Hey, everyone, if you're just joining us, you are watching La Vida Baseball Live. I'm José Menendez. This is Jennifer Mercedes joining us from beautiful Chicago, Illinois. Wait a minute, that's where we're at. Is José Olivarez. He is a poet and the author of Citizen Illegal, which we're going to talk a little more about right now. José, so in 2018, you went on a tour to support this book when it came out. You visited about 20 states as part of your hashtag Gentrification World Tour. Tell us about the significance of the tour's name, because I find it hard to believe that someone like yourself has names and titles by accident. Everything seems pretty intentional.
Yeah, absolutely. So the title of the tour was the Gentrification World Tour, not
Pardon
the
me.
gentrification. Gentrification is one of the poems in the book. It's a poem, it's a word that I first heard when I was hanging out with one of my friends, the poet Nate Marshall. We were in Chicago, we were hanging out, I want to say in Logan Square, and Nate turned to me and he was like, "Yo, Jose, we're gentrifying this bar right now." And I was like, my mind was blown. I was like, "We're gentrifying the bar? That sounds incredible. Let's gentrify the whole city." So for me,
Copyright that.
yeah. So it's complicated. So it turns out that in Los Angeles, gentrification means something different. And so I've gotten like some pushback from people in Los Angeles, or, you know, maybe it's like a West Coast in particular, but I've gotten pushback from people who know gentrification to be basically like the gentrification of poor areas by like well-educated, kind of, you know, yuppies, but like Latinx yuppies who come back into the hood and then take over and kick out, you know, some of the poor business owners. So I've started to use that word less, but for me, when I first heard it, it was like a word of great possibility.
We're gentrifying the airwaves right now by having this
That's
conversation.
Right. Yeah.
Except on the West Coast. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to use it.
But it's a great word. I love it.
It is.
Gentrify.
Right.
So gentrify. Let's gentrify these neighborhoods.
So, Jose, in your book, you have a lot of allusions to heaven, and I want to ask you about how you use heaven as a representation for the United States.
Yeah, so in my book, I have a series of poems called Mexican Heaven. And I was trying to write about immigration in my book without writing about it directly. And so heaven became a good analogy for a number of reasons, right? Just like in the United States, there's a border in heaven, and there's, you know, St. Peter stands outside of it and decides who gets to get in and who gets to go out, right? And there's like this conversation of like, when it comes to heaven, were you good enough? In the same way that like in national conversation about immigration, there's a conversation about good immigrants versus bad immigrants. And I wanted, you know, for me, it feels like that conversation is fruitless. Like everyone deserves the opportunity to like live a good life and to have choices and to, you know, have a job and earn money and have healthcare. Like to me, those are human rights. And so it doesn't matter if you're quote unquote a good immigrant or a bad immigrant, you should have those choices. And so in my book, Mexican Heaven became a way to write about this situation.
So wait, just for clarification, because I haven't finished the whole book, Mexican Heaven isn't Tuesdays at Taco Bell?
No, in fact, that seems like not Taco Bell. Especially here in Chicago, there's so many better Tuesdays at 8 p.m. options than Taco Bell.
I totally agree, my bad. In a second, I'm going to ask you to recite a Mexican dream of heaven, if you don't mind. But before that, next week, we're going to start the United States celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, considering the climate here in the United States as it pertains to undocumented folks. What does Hispanic Heritage Month mean to you? Is it still a celebratory occasion?
So that's a good question. So because I'm a touring artist, Latinx Heritage Month is also, you know, for me, that's the time when I like make the most money, because that's the time when people are like asking me to fly out and go do all these different things. So it means to me one thing, like as an artist and a business person, but it's also something that I think about, like when I was in school, we didn't really have many things for Latinx Heritage Month. I don't think I heard about it until I left for college. And so getting a chance to visit schools and to talk about all of the incredible lineages that we come from, you know what I mean? To get to talk about Sandra Cisneros' work and what it has meant to me. To get to talk about Brenda Cárdenas and Ada Limón and all of these writers who have paved the way, you know, Soror Juana. Like it's just people often like to imagine that Latinx people just arrived in the United States when we have been here for a long, long time. And like indigenous Latinx people have been here from the very beginning. You know what I mean? So we've been here. Our history is long. Our history is powerful. And for me, that's what that time is good for, right? It's like a chance to honor our history and honor our culture.
So, Jose, I have a question because we talked about it this morning. You changed Hispanic heritage to Latinx heritage. Why?
To me, because Hispanic emphasizes like the Spanish part of our inheritance, and for me, it's much more important to emphasize like the Latin American parts of our inheritance. You know, there's problems with both of those identifications. For me, I find more power in Latinx than Hispanic, so that's why I choose that one.
But do you see how he changed it like a gentleman? He was like, you mean a Latinx heritage?
And we were talking about this, and hopefully we can, in the off season, you would probably be one of the guests to be included. I think that we should do a roundtable on the Hispanic and Latin cultures and the differences and the nuances that we all experience, and the lineage from the Spaniards into our Latinx countries and all of that. I think it would be such an interesting conversation because it's just so many complexities involved.
And Jose would rhyme all his answers, which would make it incredibly compelling. So in closing, Jose, bars, son. You grew up listening to Nas. So if you would humor us, a Mexican dreams of heaven.
You want me to read all 8 parts?
No, just the one that you find the most captivating, if that's even easy for you to do, because these are all your children. I'm sure it's hard to pick one.
Right.
It's like 4 hours long.
No.
All right, so I'll read.
Do a couple of parts if you'd like.
Do a couple parts? All right,
yeah.
Cool. Here's one part. Mexican heaven. It turns out God is one of those religious Mexicans who doesn't drink or smoke weed. So all the Mexicans in heaven party in the basement while God reads the Bible and thumbs a rosary. God threatens to kick all the Mexican out of heaven si no paran con las, I don't want to curse. So the Mexicans drink more discreetly. They smoke outside where God won't smell the weed. God pretends the Mexicans are reformed. Hallelujah. This cycle repeats once a month. Amen. That's one. Oh, wow. Y'all are good with the snapping. I'll read one more. This is also called Mexican heaven. There are white people in heaven too. They build condos across the street and ask the Mexicans to speak English. I'm just kidding. There are no white people in heaven.
Damn, son. It just got real, kid. To pick up Citizen Illegal, go to any Chicago local bookstore. You can certainly find it on Amazon. Damn, got artwork by our guy Scent Rock too.
That's right.
Or for more information, go to joseolivarez.com. An absolute pleasure, brother. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Shout out to everybody watching La Vida Baseball. Thank you so much. Catch you guys soon.
Thank you. It was a
Salute,
pleasure.
man. We'll catch you at Taco Bell for Mexican Heaven Tuesdays.
No way. Absolutely not. Go White Sox.
Peace out.